now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. O'Brien described the situation in my country that it is brutal, and I am in full agreement with him. However, I differ with him in describing the manifestations and reasons for this brutality. Therefore, in my statement, I will try to shed light on the reality of this brutality, which sheds the blood of my people and destroys the infrastructure and brings all kinds of terrorists to my country. As a matter of fact, this is a matter which is brutal, contributed to by some states of the world and some states in this council. Mr. President, it is regrettable, as a matter of fact, that despite the passage of around 5 years since the beginning of the crisis in my country, Syria, some governments still insist on using the humanitarian justification to achieve narrow political ends, as if the suffering of the Syrian people is a mere trafficking commodity and political blackmail by this government or that government. Perhaps the size of hypocrisy and cheap political usage of humanitarian suffering is clear in the way in which these states treat the humanitarian situation in Syria compared to that of humanitarian situation in other states. The Security Council have adopted 15 resolutions on the situation in Syria, 4 out of which relates to the humanitarian situation in Syria. Yearly, the Council has adopted dozens of official sessions and side meetings, which have become semi-daily. However, we have not seen any resolution to discuss the disastrous humanitarian situation in Palestine, Libya, Yemen, or Somalia, despite the fact that Mr. O'Brien has indicated in one of the meetings of the Security Council that the humanitarian situation in Yemen is much worse than that in Syria. More than 80% of the Yemeni people is in pressing need of humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, as a government in the Syrian Arab Republic, we cannot deny that there is a humanitarian crisis in my country, Syria. There are displaced refugees and disadvantaged, and they are in the millions. However, we deplore the erroneous manner in dealing with this crisis since the beginning and up to this moment. We find it strange looking at it partially in isolation from the external political, military, and economic interference in the Syrian landscape, as you will know. We do not deny the depth of the humanitarian crisis. However, we refuse that it be dealt with other than seriously in dealing with the origin and reasons for this crisis, that is the spread of armed terrorist groups supported from outside and their proliferation in the villages and cities, using civilians as human shields. The USG called these armed terrorist groups supported from outside, spreading in the villages and cities and towns, called them armed groups, not from states. We haven't witnessed any humanitarian crisis other than in the areas where these terrorist groups entered. What adds insult to injury is that some states impose unilateral coercive measures on the Syrian people. This has aggravated our suffering. It is not understood in this connection that some insist on denying the role of the Syrian government, trying to portray it as first and foremost responsible for the humanitarian crisis, as we have witnessed right now in the statement just delivered. The paradox nature of this scene reaches its upper limits when some accuse the Syrian government of besieging some areas and trying to starve its people. However, they are unable to interpret the continued outflow of armed terrorists and financing them to these regions which they claim that our government besiege. These terrorist groups launch rocket attacks indiscriminately at the civilian areas and carry out suicidal explosions as it happened in Homs and Dimashq and Habasha. These areas are besieged from outside by the terrorist groups such as Kafriya and Foua, and for 3.5 years in Deir ez-Zor and Nablsia. Or they are internally besieged from the terrorists such as Muaddamiya, Madaya, Douma, and others. The terrorists prevent the entry of humanitarian assistance or seize them to use them or to resell them to the civilians. Therefore, we have not seen any images of so-called moderate terrorists starving. Have you ever seen an image of a terrorist who is hungry in Syria on the media? No. Only civilians are hungry. Terrorists are not hungry because they get dollars, they get weapons, and terrorists come from all over the world. They do not go hungry. It is inevitable on the civilian to go hungry. Mr. President, it has become clear that improvement of the humanitarian situation in Syria concretely and virtually and in a sustainable manner necessitates the abandonment by the government of this erroneous failing approach. How can we terminate the humanitarian crisis in Syria while the Erdogan regime is silent over the military attacks against the Syrian territories, using the Turkish territory as a passageway for the passing of thousands of FTFs, including the crossings used by the United Nations to extend humanitarian assistance, in addition to that regime supplying the terrorists with weapons and using the humanitarian assistance conveys to cover up for this matter. That regime imprisons the customs officers, judges, and journalists who expose it. How can this humanitarian crisis come to an end and the Erdogan regime uses brazenly the plight of the refugees to blackmail European states to gain financial and political support? Regrettably, some states in the Security Council cover up for the Erdogan regime. Few days ago, these states refused a balanced draft resolution emphasizes the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria, rejecting the external interference in its affairs and the outflow of refugees. All these are consensual principles nobody can deny. However, after the adoption of 15 Security Council resolutions on Syria, some try to specify the gender of angels as if it is seeking other 5 years to study and read what is transpiring in Syria in a prudent manner. The Syrian government is keen on extending all types of humanitarian assistance to all Syrians disadvantaged by the crisis, wherever they are in our territory. This is our duty, and we are committed to that. Therefore, the Syrian government is open to coordination and cooperation with all states, the UN organizations, and other international organizations working in Syria to undertake this process, including OCHA, as a matter of fact. Away from propaganda and the attempts to demonize the government of Syria, it is clear that our government is doing its best to deliver its assistance to its citizens wherever they are. To assert this, the Syrian government informed the United Nations on the 16th of February its consent to the entry of humanitarian assistance convoys to Deir ez-Zor, Kafriya, Fu'a, Madaya, Mu'addamiya, Zabadani, and Kafr Batna. These convoys is a continuation of other convoys that reached these regions and other areas. In continuation of my government's approach to facilitate the delivery of assistance to all the needy wherever they are in Syria. This was emphasized by the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Expatriates to Mr. de Mistura in his latest meeting with him in Damascus. The delay in giving consent and so-called administrative bureaucracy mentioned by Mr. O'Brien, this reveals our keenness on achieving safety and security to the humanitarian workers. We care for their safety and security. And we do not that any harm will be done to them, such as one of the suicidals will explode himself in any of these vehicles, humanitarian vehicles or convoys. And we come back to this council and we hear a different description and different stories for what is transpiring. Mr. President, solving the crisis of Syria requires two twin tracks. One, combating terrorism, and a political track. Proceeding from this, the Syrian government is committed to combating terrorism and pressing ahead with the political track. The delegation of Syria participated in the Geneva talks and demonstrated seriousness and commitment to these talks with the